If you've been gardening for any length of time, you know something interesting happens the longer you do it. Your thinking evolves. You try things, you watch how plants respond, you see what actually works in your own garden, and over time, some of the advice that you once believed starts to change. Now, I've made over 500 gardening videos over the last 9 years on this channel, and when I look back at some of those older videos, there's definitely a few things I would explain a little differently today or that I've changed my mind on. Not because the advice was crazy at the time, in most cases it actually made sense based on what I knew then. But gardening has a way of teaching you lessons season after season. So today I want to go through 7 gardening tips I've talked about years ago that I would share differently today. And a couple of these might surprise you, as will all the changes in facial hair, so don't be harsh. Tomatoes also require magnesium for good fruiting. Now, in the soil, most likely you've got plenty of magnesium in your garden soil, but in a pot, we don't know. So just as an insurance policy, we're going to add some Epsom salts. For a long time, my position was that Epsom salt wasn't necessary in garden soil, but I still thought it might be occasionally useful in containers. The reasoning seemed logical. Magnesium deficiency is fairly uncommon in most garden soils, but containers are different. They're a contained environment. The nutrients can wash out faster, you're watering more often, and the soil volume is limited. So it seemed reasonable that magnesium might run low in pots. But the more I looked into this, and the more seasons I gardened with containers and forgot to add Epsom salts, the more I realized that in most cases it simply wasn't necessary. Most quality potting mixes already contain magnesium, and many fertilizers used in container gardening include magnesium as well. And nutrients don't really work like a general plant booster. Plants only benefit from nutrients they actually lack. If magnesium isn't deficient, adding more of it doesn't help the plant grow better, and in some cases, it can actually start to create nutrient imbalances. Too much magnesium can interfere with the uptake of nutrients like calcium and potassium. So today, my advice is pretty simple. Unless you've identified an actual magnesium deficiency, there's usually no reason to add Epsom salts to your containers either. It's one of those tips that sounds helpful and cheap, but in most situations, just isn't necessary. Let the arguing in the comments commence. Another thing I showed years ago was a simple DIY soil test using baking soda and vinegar. The idea is that you mix soil with water, and then you add either vinegar or baking soda. And if vinegar causes fizzing, the soil is alkaline. If baking soda causes the fizzing, the soil is acidic. This is one of those tricks that spreads around the gardening world because it sounds clever, cheap again, and easy. But the problem is, it's not that accurate. Soil chemistry is far more complex than a simple reaction like that can measure. Organic matter, minerals in the soil, and the buffering capacity can all influence those reactions. So what you end up with is a test that might fizz, but doesn't really tell you about your soil's actual pH. And soil pH is an important factor in gardening because it affects how available nutrients are to your plants. So these days, if someone wants to know their soil pH, I recommend something much simpler. A real soil test kit, or send a soil sample to your local extension office. For a few dollars, you'll get accurate information that can actually help you improve your soil. I will say, even though I've changed my mind on this, it's one of my videos I've watched many times because that little boy in that video is graduating from high school in a couple of months. I can't believe it. This next one is from the first video that I had actually get a lot of views. I was planting lavender in our clay soil, and I offered what I now know is not great advice.
If you live in a wet climate or have a lot of humidity, you really want to improve the drainage of the soil. And you can do that by adding a lot of sand and gravel both beneath the plant in the hole and into the backfill for the dirt around the roots.
On the surface, adding sand sounds logical. Clay holds water. Sand drains quickly. Mix them together and you should get better drainage. But in reality, that combination often creates something closer to brick or concrete than healthy soil. Clay particles are extremely small and they pack tightly together. When sand is added, those particles can actually fill in the spaces between the sand grains, and that makes the soil structure even denser. What actually improves clay soil is organic matter. Materials like compost, leaves, plant debris. They help form aggregates in the soil, little clumps that create spaces where air and water can move. Those spaces are what allow roots to grow and soil life to thrive. And over time, repeated additions of organic matter can dramatically improve the structure of clay soil. So if you're dealing with heavy clay, skip the sand and focus on adding organic matter year after year. That's really what makes a difference. Now, in the special case of lavender, which is a Mediterranean plant that, yes, needs good drainage, but it also needs soil that isn't nutrient rich, which is what compost would do, right? So instead of adding compost to a Mediterranean dry soil, you want to add gypsum to the soil. Add a layer of gravel beneath the root zone and plant them on a bit of a hill so the water drains off. So I'm going to go ahead and clip this right here. It might be painful to do, but trust me, you're going to be happy you did it. The idea that removing the top growing point forces a plant to branch out and become bushier and therefore produce more peppers is absolutely true for people in longer growing seasons like me. Now, I've learned since that video that my audience spans the globe and therefore many different climate zones. So while this idea works in terms of producing more over the long haul, when you remove that top growth early on, the plant has to spend some time recovering before it continues growing. And that delay can push harvests later in the season. So if you already have a short growing season, you may not get a harvest if you pinch your pepper plants. So while topping peppers can produce a bushier plant, I now make sure to explain this fully so it helps those who can do it, but doesn't hurt those who shouldn't. Here's another one that I have been raked over the coals for in the many years since this video came out. If you take a look at this tomato, you'll see little hairs all the way up and down the stem. And each one of those hairs is just waiting to come in contact with the soil. And when it does, it's going to put down roots. This fact wasn't in the original plans for that video, but the night before I filmed that, I was watching a TV show with an internationally known gardener. I won't reveal who it was. And this person said that the little hairs on tomato stems are actually tiny roots waiting to grow. I had never heard that before. And because I respected this gardener along with the whole world, I thought, amazing, what good timing. I'll add that to tomorrow's video. Well, that video now has over 14 million views, and I've been paying for that last-minute addition ever since. Now, tomato plants absolutely can grow roots along their stems when buried, but those little hairs you see on the stem are actually something called trichomes. They're tiny plant hairs that serve a variety of purposes, including helping protect the plant and helping regulate moisture. Now, tomatoes do form what are called adventitious roots along their stems, but they do that when conditions are right. But those roots develop from specific tissues in the stem itself, not from the hairs. So while the idea that those hairs are future roots is a common explanation, it's not exactly how the process works. The tomatoes will produce roots everywhere their stem touches the soil. So the deeper we can plant it, the more roots we're going to get. In that video, and a few since, I recommended planting deep for that reason. It was widely accepted that planting tomatoes deeper gives you a more productive plant. But over time, I started paying closer attention to this in my own garden. And what I realized was that it often doesn't make much difference at all. Other experienced gardeners I've talked to feel the same. In most garden soils, tomatoes are already very capable of developing a large root system without needing to bury a few extra inches of stem underground. If the soil is healthy and loose enough for roots to grow, the plant will usually establish itself just fine, even when planted at the same depth it was growing in the pot. So while planting tomatoes deeper isn't harmful, it also is not the magic trick it's been made out to be. If you have soil that dries out quickly, then getting roots deeper where soil moisture is more consistent could help. But overall, it isn't worth the time and the energy. And finally, let's talk about compost. You'll often hear that compost is completely safe and that you can add as much as you want without worrying about harming plants. I used to say that until I got some salty compost that burned all of my seedlings. And while compost is one of the best things you can add to your garden, it's not entirely true that it can never cause problems. If compost isn't fully finished, it can be too strong, especially if it contains a large amount of manure. Immature compost can release compounds like ammonia that can stress or damage plants. Now, the compost I got was mushroom compost, which I didn't know at the time can be salty. So I have started testing the salt levels in any new loads of compost I get. Salt will flush out of compost fairly quickly and generally won't set later plants back. But if you try to germinate seeds in it or plant very small seedlings in it, it can kill them pretty quickly. So while compost is incredibly beneficial, the key is using well-finished compost and testing for salt, and unfortunately now herbicides like Grazon, which can ruin your garden for several years. A good test for Grazon for any new load of compost you bring in is to plant a couple of corn seeds and a couple of bean seeds. If the corn comes up looking normal, but the beans are deformed and misshapen, that's a good sign of Grazon contamination. One of the things I enjoy most about gardening is that it's a constant learning process. Every season teaches you something. Sometimes that involves a new technique that works better than whatever you were doing before, and sometimes it means looking back at something you used to believe and realizing there's a better way to do it now. It's just part of becoming a more experienced gardener, because the longer you grow food, the more you realize that gardening isn't about following a perfect set of rules. It's about understanding why things work. And once you understand that, you can adapt what you're doing to your own soil, your own climate, and your own garden. And speaking of experience, there's actually some vegetables that I've grown over the years that I eventually decided just weren't worth the space in my garden. If you want to see those, check out this video on the screen right here about 8 crops I will never grow again. I'll see you guys next time.